The cold night wind whispered through the towering walls of Jerusalem, carrying the distant scent of burning wood and dry earth. The siege had stretched on for weeks, an unbearable weight pressing down on the city. King Hezekiah stood at the highest point of his palace, his eyes scanning the rooftops and narrow streets below, where the last flickers of candlelight revealed the restless shadows of his people. Beyond the walls, the enemy fires burned like a second sky, stretching endlessly into the darkness. The Assyrians had come like an unstoppable tide, their banners dark against the moonlit plains, their warriors hardened by conquest. They had left nothing but ruin in their path, entire cities swallowed by fire, kings dragged in chains, nations reduced to dust. And now they stood at Jerusalem's gates, certain that this city, like all the others before it, would soon fall. Yet Hezekiah did not surrender to despair. He had done everything in his power, reinforced the walls, secured the water supply by redirecting the springs, armed every capable man. Still, he knew that no army, no fortification could withstand the sheer force of the Assyrian war machine. His only true defense lay beyond the realm of men. Hezekiah turned away from the cityscape and let out a slow breath. He had prayed, he had sought the counsel of the prophet Isaiah, and Isaiah's message had been clear. Jerusalem would not fall, not by the strength of its warriors, nor by the height of its walls, but by the hand of the Almighty. And so Hezekiah waited, his faith anchoring him in the midst of the storm. Across the valley, in the sprawling Assyrian encampment, the air was thick with the scent of roasted meat and the murmur of confident voices. Soldiers drank and laughed around their fires, their armor gleaming red in the flickering glow. At the heart of the camp, inside a massive scarlet tent, King Sennacherib reclined on a throne of ivory and gold. He barely spared a thought for the city ahead. Victory was a certainty, and he had no patience for men who clung to the illusion of divine protection. He had seen too many so-called gods fall, statues shattered, temples burned, prayers left unanswered. The God of Israel would be no different. His commander, Rabshakeh, had already made a public spectacle of their superiority. He had stood outside the city walls, his voice carrying over the trembling crowd, mocking their king, mocking their God. Did the gods of Hamath or Arpad save them? He had sneered. Did the gods of Sepharvaim, Hena, and Iva deliver their people? What makes you think your God is any different? The words had hung in the air like a curse. Sennacherib had heard no reply from the Israelites, only the hollow silence of a city waiting for its inevitable doom. Yet, on this night, something felt different. The air had changed, heavy, charged with something unseen. The wind had stilled, and the distant howls of the desert had quieted, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. Inside the city, the tension was suffocating. Families huddled together in their homes, whispering prayers into the darkness, their voices trembling with both fear and hope. Mothers clutched their children close, pressing their faces into their chests to shield them from the weight of impending doom. The marketplace, once bustling with life, now stood eerily empty, its stalls abandoned, fruits and grains left to rot beneath the oppressive silence. Even the bravest warriors, men who had fought through blood and fire, sat in grim stillness, their hands gripping their swords with white-knuckled determination. They had heard the stories of the Assyrians, their cruelty, their relentless conquest, their insatiable hunger for destruction. They knew that if the walls fell, there would be no mercy, and so all of Jerusalem seemed to hold its breath, caught in the fragile space between despair and faith. Hezekiah did not sleep that night. He paced the halls of his palace, the echo of his footsteps lost in the vast, empty corridors. The torches cast long shadows on the stone walls, their flickering light making the engraved scriptures dance like living words. His mind was a battlefield of doubts and prayers, his heart torn between the weight of his people's fear and the promise of Isaiah's prophecy. Would God truly deliver them? He clenched his jaw, pushing the doubt away. He could not afford to waver. Stepping into the inner chamber, he knelt before the sacred altar, his hands gripping its edges as he lowered his head. "O Lord, God of Israel," he whispered, his voice raw, "you alone are God over all the kingdoms of the earth. You have made the heavens and the earth. Incline your ear, O Lord, and hear. Open your eyes, O Lord, and see. Deliver us, so that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that you alone are God." The words left his lips like fire, desperate, pleading, unwavering, and then silence. A silence so deep, so absolute, it felt as if the heavens themselves had paused to listen. Beyond the walls, the Assyrian camp remained alive with the sounds of conquest. Soldiers sharpening their blades, feasting on stolen livestock, boasting of the riches they would plunder. Beneath the vast canopy of stars, Sennacherib's banners flapped in the wind, adorned with the images of winged lions and battle-hardened kings. The Assyrians had no fear of Jerusalem, no doubt in their victory. They had brought thousands upon thousands of men, seasoned warriors who had torn down greater cities, crushed mightier kings. What was Jerusalem to them but another name on their list of conquests? Yet as the night deepened, an unease crept into the air. The fires burned lower, the laughter grew softer, and somewhere, on the edges of their consciousness, a shadow began to stir, something unseen, something vast, something ancient. A lone watchman stood atop Jerusalem's highest tower, gripping his spear as he scanned the horizon. His body ached from exhaustion, but he dared not close his eyes. He had watched the Assyrian army gather like a storm cloud over the valley, a sea of iron and fire stretching beyond what the eye could see. Even now, in the dead of night, he could make out the faint glow of their torches, scattered like embers across the land. The sight was suffocating. He had heard the elders speak of the might of Assyria, how their warriors flayed men alive, how they stacked the skulls of their enemies at city gates as a warning. But this was different. This was real. And yet, as he looked up at the sky, at the vast expanse of stars shining undisturbed above the battlefield, he felt a strange sense of stillness. Something was coming. He could not see it, he could not hear it, but he could feel it, a presence pressing down upon the night, heavy and unseen, like the weight of an oncoming storm. Deep inside the palace, Hezekiah still knelt, his forehead resting against the stone floor. The world outside was on the brink of devastation, but in that moment he was alone with God. The silence around him was thick, unbroken, but his heart burned with an unseen fire. He thought of the stories of his forefathers, the parting of the Red Sea, the fall of Jericho, the voice of God speaking from a burning bush. Had Yahweh changed? Had his power waned? No. Hezekiah clung to that truth as a drowning man clings to a rope. If the Lord had delivered his people before, he would do it again. The king's breathing steadied, his pulse slowing, his fear dissolving into something else entirely, certainty. His lips moved once more, but this time the words were not a plea. They were a declaration. "The Lord will fight for us." And as the final syllable left his mouth, a gust of wind swept through the chamber, snuffing out the torch beside him. Outside the city, the Assyrian camp stirred in uneasy sleep. Soldiers turned in their blankets, shifting uncomfortably on the hard ground. The fires burned lower, the shadows grew longer. The war horses, battle-hardened and unshaken by bloodshed, suddenly stamped their hooves and snorted, ears twitching at something unseen. The wind had changed, carrying a scent that did not belong, something ancient, something foreign, something that made the hairs on the backs of men's necks rise in warning. A commander near the main tent frowned, gripping the hilt of his sword as he glanced around. The night was too quiet. The usual howls of distant jackals had vanished. The murmurs of the wind through the valley had stilled. It was as if the world itself had gone silent in anticipation. He stepped forward, meaning to call out to the sentries, but before the words could leave his mouth, A shadow moved in the corner of his vision, fast, impossible, unnatural. He turned sharply, but there was nothing there. And then, from the depths of the darkness, something stirred. A sudden gust of wind rushed through the valley, cold and unnatural, snuffing out several torches in an instant. The Assyrian commander took a slow, cautious step forward, his hand tightening around his sword. He had been in countless battles, had seen men gutted and cities burned, but this was different. His instincts screamed at him, an ancient warning buried deep within the marrow of his bones. He scanned the darkness, the flickering remains of the dying fires, casting shifting shadows across the camp. Something was wrong. The men around him stirred, their uneasy murmurs barely louder than the whispering wind. And then, just as his lips parted to call for the sentries, a sound broke through the silence, a deep, resonant hum, like the vibration of 1,000 unseen wings moving in unison. In the city, the watchman at the tower jolted upright, his pulse hammering. He had heard it too, a low, droning tremor that seemed to rise from the very ground beneath his feet. He clutched his spear, stepping back instinctively as an overwhelming pressure filled the air around him. It was as if the sky itself had grown heavier, pressing down upon the city, upon the earth, upon his very soul. He wanted to shout, to warn the others, but his voice caught in his throat. His eyes darted to the Assyrian camp below. The fires were flickering violently now, as if struggling against an unseen force. The soldiers were rising from their bedrolls, gripping their weapons, their shouts laced with confusion. And then darkness. A shadow, vast and formless, stretched across the camp, swallowing the light, devouring the stars. The watchman staggered backward, his breath shuddering in his chest. He had no words for what he was seeing. Inside his palace, Hezekiah's eyes opened. He felt it. A presence beyond comprehension, neither seen nor heard, yet undeniable in its power. He pushed himself up from the floor, his knees weak beneath him. The chamber was shrouded in darkness now, save for the faintest glimmer of moonlight through the window. He swallowed hard, stepping forward, his breath coming in shallow, measured gasps, and then a whisper. Not with ears did he hear it, but with something deeper, something within his very spirit. A single word, spoken without sound, yet carrying the weight of eternity. It is done. Hezekiah exhaled sharply, gripping the edge of the altar to steady himself. Whatever had come, whatever force had descended upon the valley, it had already begun. In the Assyrian camp, panic ignited like wildfire. Men scrambled to their feet, eyes darting wildly in the darkness, weapons clashing as they fumbled to arm themselves against an enemy they could not see. The air had changed. It was thick, suffocating, charged with something unnatural. Some clutched their throats, gasping as if the very breath had been stolen from their lungs. Others fell to their knees, their faces contorted in terror, hands grasping at their armor, as if trying to peel away an invisible force crushing them from within. The commander spun in place, his mind reeling, his senses failing to comprehend. What was unfolding before him? The humming sound had grown deeper, stronger, vibrating through the very bones of the earth. And then, with no warning, a force struck the camp. Not with fire, nor with blade, but with something far more terrible. A silence, absolute and deafening. And in that silence, death moved unseen. From the city walls, the watchmen could do nothing but stare, frozen in place as the impossible unfolded before their eyes. The Assyrian camp, once alive with movement, was now a mass of writhing shadows, indistinct figures collapsing where they stood. Some clutched their chests, some clawed at their faces, others simply crumpled as if their very souls had been plucked from their bodies. The fires continued to flicker, but no sound came from below. No battle cries, no final screams, just a vast, all-consuming stillness. It was as if the hand of God himself had reached into the camp, sweeping through the ranks with a force beyond comprehension. One watchman, his voice, barely above a whisper, muttered, "They are falling without a fight." His companion, unable to tear his eyes away, simply nodded, his grip tightening on the stone ledge before him. Neither of them could explain it. Neither of them would ever forget it. In the palace, Hezekiah stood motionless, his breath shallow, his heart pounding. He did not need to see what was happening beyond the city walls. He knew it was over. The Lord had answered. He closed his eyes, pressing his hand against his chest, overwhelmed by the sheer weight of the moment. Relief? No, it was something deeper, something holy, a reverence that left his knees weak, his mind reeling. The God of Abraham, of Moses, of David, he had moved this night. And as Hezekiah stood there, trembling in the quiet of his chamber, he realized that no army, no kingdom, no earthly power could ever stand against the will of the Almighty. And outside, beyond the gates of Jerusalem, the Assyrian Empire had just learned that lesson in the most terrible way imaginable. The first light of dawn crept over the horizon, casting a pale glow over Jerusalem's towering walls. The city, which had spent the night gripped by terror, now stood eerily still. No war cries echoed from the Assyrian camp. No sounds of marching or preparation for battle, only silence, a silence so unnatural, so absolute, that it sent shivers down the spines of the watchmen who still clung to their posts. One of them, an older man with lines of battle and worry etched into his face, dared to lift his gaze toward the valley below. What he saw made his breath hitch in his throat. Bodies, thousands of them, strewn across the camp in grotesque stillness, their lifeless forms sprawled over the earth like fallen statues. Shields and swords lay untouched at their sides. The mighty army that had once been an unstoppable force of conquest was now nothing more than a graveyard beneath the morning sun. The old watchman clutched his chest, feeling his heart hammering violently against his ribs. He had seen war, he had seen men die in battle, but never like this, never without a single sword being drawn. Other watchmen gathered along the walls, eyes wide with disbelief, whispering prayers under their breath. Some pressed their hands to their mouths, their minds struggling to comprehend the sheer scale of what had happened. The night before, they had prepared for the worst, expecting to be slaughtered before sunrise. Now, they watched as Jerusalem stood untouched, unscathed, while the greatest army of their time lay motionless beyond their gates. A younger guard, barely past his 18th year, turned to his commander, his voice barely above a whisper. "What did this?" His hands trembled as he gripped the edge of the wall, knuckles white with tension. The commander did not answer immediately. He merely stared out at the field of death before them, his throat dry, his pulse unsteady. Then, finally, with a voice hoarse from disbelief, he murmured, "Not what? Who?" And in that single word, the reality of the moment settled upon them like a crushing weight. This was not the work of men. No army had stormed the Assyrian camp. No blade had been lifted in their defense. This was divine. A force beyond the realm of human comprehension had moved in the darkness, unseen, yet unstoppable. The news spread like wildfire through the city. People flooded the streets, weeping, shouting, lifting their hands to the heavens in awestruck praise. Some knelt in the dust, overwhelmed with the magnitude of what had taken place, while others clung to their children, whispering prayers of gratitude. Hezekiah stood at the highest terrace of his palace, gazing down upon his people as they poured into the open squares. His body felt light, almost weightless, as if the burden that had pressed upon his shoulders for so long had suddenly been lifted. The prophecy had been fulfilled. Isaiah's words had come to pass. The Lord had fought for them, just as he had promised. And now, the once mighty Sennacherib, the king who had boasted of his conquests, who had laughed at the God of Israel, was left with nothing but the ashes of his pride and the silence of his fallen empire. Hezekiah exhaled, his breath shaky, his heart swelling with an emotion too profound to name. The world would speak of this night for generations. This was no mere victory. This was a declaration, a testament to the power of the Almighty. Hezekiah's hands trembled slightly as he gripped the stone railing of the terrace. The morning sun had risen fully now, casting its golden light across the city of Jerusalem, but it felt like a different world. What had been a place of desperate prayer just hours before now felt like a sacred sanctuary bathed in divine light. The sounds of joy, of praise filled the streets below him, a chorus of voices crying out to God in gratitude. He closed his eyes, his mind replaying the events of the night, the dark pressure that had gripped the air, the unnatural silence, and the overwhelming sense that something far greater than human understanding had intervened. He had stood in that same palace just hours before, overwhelmed with the weight of his decisions, the fate of his people hanging in the balance. Now he felt as if he were standing in the very presence of God himself. His heart swelled with humility, knowing that he had done nothing but place his trust in the Almighty. And in return, the Almighty had delivered them from certain death. Hezekiah whispered a prayer under his breath, "Thank you, Lord, for your mercy." Across the valley, beyond the city walls, the Assyrian camp lay still, a haunting reminder of the night's devastation. The field was littered with the bodies of warriors who had once been the fiercest on earth, men who had conquered cities, toppled kingdoms, and instilled terror wherever they marched. Now they were nothing but corpses, their strength and fury extinguished in an instant. The wind carried a faint, almost mournful scent of death, of decay, as it whispered through the abandoned camp. No one dared to approach the bodies. They were not to be touched, not by any man. They had fallen not at the hands of a mighty army, but at the hands of something far more powerful, something unseen and untouchable. The Assyrians, the conquerors of the known world, had been humbled in a way they would never understand. A few soldiers, still alive but in a state of shock, stumbled through the camp, their eyes wide and wild, their hands trembling as they surveyed the destruction. None of them could speak, none of them could explain what had happened. It was as if they had been smitten by a force that even their gods could not withstand. Back in Jerusalem, the news of the Assyrian defeat reached the temple, where the priests and elders gathered in solemn awe. The high priest, his robes draped in fine linen, stood in the center of the holy space, his hands lifted in silent worship. His heart beat with a rhythm of awe and reverence, knowing that he had witnessed the fulfillment of prophecy. He had heard the words of Isaiah spoken in the courts of the king, the promise that the Assyrians would not breach the walls of Jerusalem, that God himself would deliver the city. Now, standing in the sanctuary of the temple, he understood the magnitude of what had occurred. This was not simply a battle won. This was a divine intervention, a display of God's sovereignty that could not be denied. He turned to the other priests, his voice barely a whisper. "The Lord has shown himself mighty in our midst." The words felt too small to capture the enormity of what had happened, and yet they were all they had. In that moment, they understood that their faith had been proven true. God was not distant, he was not absent. He had been there, watching over them, delivering them from destruction. As word of the Assyrian defeat spread through the streets, the people of Jerusalem began to assemble in the temple courts, gathering in reverent silence. There was no need for the king to issue a decree, no need to call the people to worship. They came on their own, moved by an impulse they could not explain, drawn together by something far beyond human will. Hezekiah, now standing at the entrance of the temple, looked out over the sea of faces, each one reflecting awe, gratitude, and an unspoken understanding that this victory was not their own. It was God's, and they had been the recipients of his mercy. The king's heart swelled with emotion, but he knew his role was not to stand at the center of the people's praise. This moment belonged to God alone. He moved toward the altar, his steps slow and deliberate, and when he reached it, he fell to his knees. With tears in his eyes, he whispered the prayer that had been burning in his heart since the night before. Lord, your will has been done, and I am but a servant in your hands. The priests, led by the high priest, moved in procession toward the altar, each step measured, each moment steeped in reverence. They had prepared the sacrifices not just for the victory, but for the deliverance of their people. The incense rose in tendrils of fragrant smoke, curling upward toward the heavens as the priests offered their praise and thanksgiving. They knew, as the people knew, that this was a moment that would echo through the generations. This was not simply a battle that had been won. This was the hand of God, manifest and undeniable. The sacrifices they offered were not just rituals, they were acts of profound gratitude. The people stood in awe, silent and still, as the smoke of their prayers and praise rose toward the sky, mingling with the dawn's first light. In that moment, Jerusalem was united in a singular purpose: to give thanks to the Almighty, to recognize His sovereignty, and to honor the God who had delivered them from the brink of destruction. But even as the people of Jerusalem rejoiced, a shadow still lingered in the minds of some. A few, though they dared not voice it aloud, questioned the finality of their victory. The Assyrian king, Sennacherib, was not a man to be taken lightly. His empire stretched across the known world, and his reputation was built on his cruelty, his ruthlessness, and his unyielding desire for conquest. Was he truly finished? Had the God of Israel truly destroyed his army? Or had this defeat simply been a temporary setback? Hezekiah, sensing the murmurs of doubt even among his own people, knew the truth. This was not just a battle, this was a declaration of God's ultimate authority. And even if Sennacherib returned, even if his forces regrouped and attempted to strike again, God had already proven his power. The king's heart was set at peace, not by the absence of danger, but by the unshakable assurance that the Almighty was on their side. He knew that no human force could stand against the will of God. Days passed, but the people of Jerusalem could not forget the image of the Assyrian camp, now nothing more than a vast cemetery of fallen soldiers. The story of that night was retold over and over in hushed tones, each recounting filled with awe, disbelief, and reverence. The echoes of the battle that never happened resonated in every corner of the city. Some spoke of the angel they believed had come down to strike the Assyrians. Others simply called it a miracle, but no one could deny the presence of something beyond human understanding. Even those who had doubted, those who had feared the wrath of Sennacherib's army, now stood in silent acknowledgement of the power that had protected them. Yet, while the city celebrated, a quiet fear began to take root in the hearts of the surrounding nations. The stories of Jerusalem's miraculous deliverance began to spread like wildfire, reaching the ears of kings and generals far and wide. The name of God, of Israel, began to stir fear in hearts that had never before known the terror of his power. Jerusalem had become a symbol of divine favor, a beacon of hope, and an unshakable testament to the fact that God's will could not be thwarted. But the question lingered in the minds of those who listened. Would this be the end of Assyria's arrogance, or would they come back for vengeance? Meanwhile, in the heart of Assyria, the great king Sennacherib sat in his palace, his once mighty confidence shattered. His warriors, who had once crushed all who stood in their path, now lay defeated and broken before him. His own people could not look him in the eye, and the empire he had built with iron and blood now felt the tremors of an uncertainty he had never known. Sennacherib's heart burned with humiliation, but his pride would not allow him to accept the defeat without seeking revenge. The failure to capture Jerusalem had been more than just a setback. It was an affront to his very authority, to the might of his gods, and to his destiny as the ruler of the world. He gathered his advisors and military leaders in a darkened room, his voice trembling with rage as he swore to bring Jerusalem to its knees, no matter the cost. Yet, beneath his fury, a deep fear gnawed at him. Something beyond his understanding had intervened that night, something far more powerful than he could ever have imagined. For the first time in his life, the king of Assyria felt small, vulnerable. He would rally his forces, but he knew that if he was to defeat Jerusalem, he would have to contend not just with men, but with the very God who had defended it. Back in Jerusalem, Hezekiah's faith did not waver. He had seen the hand of God move in a way that no human could explain, and he knew that his responsibility now was to lead his people in trust, not in fear. Despite the remnants of doubt still clinging to some of the people, Hezekiah remained unwavering in his belief that God would continue to protect them. He spent his days in prayer and in consultation with the prophet Isaiah, seeking guidance, wisdom, and strength for the days to come. He had no illusions that the Assyrians might not return. He knew the pride of Sennacherib would drive him to act. But Hezekiah also knew that their strength was not in their own weapons or their own strategies. It was in the power of the God who had already delivered them once. His heart was steady, his resolve firm. He would not allow fear to rule over the people. As he stood in the temple, gazing out over the city, he felt the weight of history upon him. This was not just about the survival of Jerusalem, it was about the testimony of God's greatness to the world. And Hezekiah knew that nothing, not even the greatest empire on earth, could stand in the way of God's will. The days that followed were marked by a growing sense of tension that hung in the air, like the calm before a storm. In the streets of Jerusalem, people went about their daily routines, but the once unshakable confidence had given way to a more cautious optimism. They had seen what God could do. They had witnessed his miraculous intervention. And yet they could not ignore the looming possibility that the Assyrian king would rally his forces for a final assault. Hezekiah, despite the victory, understood that the battle was far from over. He had seen the strength of God firsthand, but he also knew that the world did not work in neat, predictable patterns. The Assyrians would not go quietly into the night. They would return. He began preparing Jerusalem for the worst, fortifying the city and gathering its defenses. But in his heart there was something greater than any earthly preparation. There was an unshakable peace, a trust that God's will would unfold according to his purpose. In the midst of the military preparations, Hezekiah did not lose sight of the spiritual preparations that were just as vital. He continued to lead his people in prayer, reminding them that their strength did not lie in the weapons they crafted, but in the God who had delivered them once before. And then, as if to test the resolve of the people, word came that Sennacherib had indeed begun to mobilize his forces once more. The news sent a ripple of fear through Jerusalem. The people knew what this meant. They knew the Assyrian king would not rest until his pride had been restored, until the city that had humiliated him had been brought to its knees. The siege was inevitable. Yet, even as the word spread, something strange began to happen. As the people of Jerusalem began to gird themselves for what seemed like an impending doom, they also began to gather with greater fervor in their places of worship. They knew they could not fight this battle alone. The king had ordered sacrifices to be made, not just for the survival of the city, but for the strength of their faith. Hezekiah, in his wisdom, understood that the true weapon against the Assyrian army was not military might, but the unwavering belief that God would fulfill his promise. The priests, led by the high priest, began to chant prayers of intercession, their voices rising up as one. There was a unity among the people, a bond that transcended fear, a collective recognition that their salvation lay not in their own strength, but in the mercy of the Lord. And then, in the darkest hour of the siege, a miracle greater than anyone could have imagined unfolded before their eyes. The very thing that Hezekiah had placed his trust in, the promise of God's deliverance, was revealed in a way that left the entire city speechless. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the city's stone walls, a strange calm fell over the land. No war cries were heard, no marching steps approached. It was as though the very air had thickened with a presence, an unmistakable sense of divine authority that gripped the hearts of those who stood on the walls. A hush spread across the city. People gathered in their homes, in the courtyards, in the temples, waiting, watching, as the hours passed with an unsettling stillness. It was during this eerie quiet that a report came from the watchmen along the walls. They had seen movement in the Assyrian camp, but it was not the usual signs of a war camp. It was a sight that no one could quite explain. The entire camp, once filled with soldiers preparing for battle, was now strangely empty. The watchman's report spread like wildfire through Jerusalem, and the atmosphere in the city shifted. At first, the people thought it was some kind of trick, some strange maneuver meant to draw them out, to make them think the Assyrians had given up. But as more reports came in, each one confirming the same impossible truth, the Assyrian camp was abandoned. Fear gave way to confusion, and then to cautious hope. The priests and elders convened once again in the temple, their faces solemn, their voices hushed. They did not know what to make of this turn of events, but they understood the importance of the moment. Hezekiah himself, ever the leader, moved swiftly to gather the people. Wordlessly, he led them in prayer, their voices rising together in a solemn, unified cry to God. Their prayer was not a plea for victory. It was a prayer of gratitude, a recognition that what had transpired was beyond human explanation. The king's heart swelled with a quiet certainty that God had indeed intervened, but what this meant for the future, no one knew. The only thing that mattered now was that Jerusalem had been spared. As the night wore on, the city remained tense, but the fear that had gripped the people began to ebb away. The Assyrian forces, once an unstoppable juggernaut, were now gone, vanished without a trace. The watchmen on the walls remained alert, but they saw no sign of attack. There was no sound of drums, no clanking of armor, no cries of war. It was as if the entire army had simply melted into the night, leaving no trace behind. Hezekiah could hardly believe his eyes when he stood on the palace terrace, staring out toward the valley. For so long he had seen the army of Sennacherib gathering, growing larger by the day, a looming threat that seemed invincible. And now, nothing. He didn't know what to make of it. Was this the result of the prayers, of the trust they had placed in God's hands, or was there something more to it, something hidden, something deeper? He turned his gaze back to the city, his heart heavy with the weight of unanswered questions. But for now the silence was enough. The city was safe, and that was all that mattered. It wasn't until the following morning that the full extent of the miracle became clear. As the sun broke over the horizon, the first messengers arrived in the city, their faces pale, their words trembling. They had come from the ruins of the Assyrian camp, and what they had witnessed there was beyond anything they had ever seen. It was not just an abandoned camp, it was a scene of absolute devastation. Everywhere they looked, they saw the bodies of soldiers, hundreds, maybe thousands, lying dead on the ground, their faces frozen in terror. The air was thick with the smell of death, and the messengers spoke in hushed tones, as if afraid that speaking too loudly might break the fragile sense of awe that had settled over the city. No one could explain how so many had died, how a powerful army had been reduced to nothing in the span of a single night. The only thing that was clear was that this was no ordinary victory. This was a supernatural intervention. The king's heart raced as he listened to the reports, his mind struggling to process the magnitude of what had happened. This wasn't just a battle won. This was a testimony of God's power, a message sent to the nations that would not soon be forgotten. As word of the Assyrian massacre spread through Jerusalem, the atmosphere in the city shifted from cautious optimism to outright awe. The people gathered in the streets, eyes wide in disbelief, recounting every detail of the events that had unfolded the night before. It was as though the very breath of life had been breathed into the city again, and the streets, which had been filled with anxiety and fear just days before, now pulsed with a renewed energy. In every corner there was talk of the miraculous intervention that had saved them. Even those who had been uncertain of God's hand at work in their midst now found themselves humbled by the sheer magnitude of what had occurred. Hezekiah, ever the leader, called the people to come together in the temple to offer their sacrifices of thanksgiving. The priests in full regalia began the rituals with solemnity and reverence, offering incense and prayers of gratitude. But there was something more to the atmosphere, a deep, unspoken recognition that this moment was not just another victory. It was the manifestation of divine power, a living testimony of God's protection and sovereignty. As the sacrifices burned, the smoke rising in the air seemed almost to carry the prayers of the people upward, mingling with the heavens in a way that felt both intimate and transcendent. The day wore on, but no one seemed able to shake the sensation that they were living in the midst of something sacred. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the city, the people gathered in small groups to share their stories. Each story was different, yet all of them had a common thread. Each person had felt the presence of God in that quiet, unspoken moment. It was as if the very ground they stood on had been sanctified by his power. Hezekiah himself walked the streets that evening, stopping to speak with his people, offering words of encouragement and hope. His heart was full, but there was still a lingering weight of responsibility on his shoulders. The deliverance of Jerusalem had been miraculous, but he knew that it was not a victory for Israel alone. This was a victory for God's glory, for his sovereignty to be declared to the nations. And Hezekiah, as the king, was now a steward of that message. He knew that Jerusalem's story was not just for the people of Israel. It was a message to all who would hear it, that God was not confined to the temples of men, nor was he bound by the armies of men. He was the God who was present in the moments of deepest despair, the God who could turn the tide of history with a single word. As the night deepened, Hezekiah found himself once again in the temple, kneeling before the altar. The weight of the moment pressed on him, but in his heart there was a peace that transcended understanding. He had witnessed the might of God in a way few kings ever would. He had seen the destruction of a great empire and the deliverance of his people from certain destruction. He had heard the voice of the prophet Isaiah, and he had seen the fulfillment of God's promise. But there was still something in Hezekiah's soul that stirred, something that told him that this victory was but a glimpse of what God was truly capable of. The king's heart overflowed with gratitude, but he knew that this was not the end of the story. The Assyrians may have been defeated, but there were still other nations, other powers, and other kings who would rise up against Israel. Hezekiah's prayer that night was simple but profound. Lord, may your will be done, and may your name be glorified forever. And as the flames from the altar flickered and danced in the quiet of the temple, Hezekiah felt a sense of divine purpose that burned even brighter than the fire before him. He was only a man, but in that moment he knew he had been chosen to be part of something far greater than himself. The days following the miraculous deliverance of Jerusalem were filled with a strange sense of calm, a feeling that permeated the city as if time itself had slowed to mark the significance of what had occurred. The Assyrians had vanished without a trace, and with them the fear and anxiety that had haunted the people for months dissolved into something that felt almost sacred. Hezekiah walked through the city, his presence commanding respect, but there was a humbleness in his step that matched the weight of the responsibility now upon him. He had seen the power of God with his own eyes, and he knew that this victory was not just for the people of Jerusalem, it was for the world to witness. News of the defeat spread far and wide, and soon it reached the ears of other kings and rulers across the known world. The nations trembled at the thought of the God of Israel, a God who could not be defeated, who could silence the mightiest of empires with a mere whisper. And as the stories of the Assyrian army's sudden destruction made their way across the lands, many began to wonder, could there be a power greater than the gods they had worshipped? Could this God, the God of Israel, be the true sovereign of the world? As the weeks turned into months, Hezekiah continued to lead his people with wisdom, courage, and unwavering faith. His heart remained steadfast, but there was a subtle shift in his thinking. He had always known that his faith would be tested in many ways, but now he understood more deeply the role of a leader who places his trust completely in God. The battle they had fought was not just a physical one. It was a battle for their hearts and minds, a battle for the soul of the nation. Hezekiah realized that the true test of Israel's future lay not in the defeat of one enemy, but in the continued faithfulness of his people. The victories of the past had shown that God could be trusted, but the future would require a deeper commitment. And so, Hezekiah turned his attention to building the spiritual foundation of his kingdom, reinforcing the importance of following God's commandments, not out of fear, but out of love and reverence. He established new festivals, encouraged the people to return to the worship of the one true God, and sought to ensure that the memory of that night, the night when God had come to their rescue, would never fade from their hearts. Years later, long after the Assyrians had turned their focus to other campaigns and the world had moved on from the great defeat of their army, the story of Jerusalem's deliverance lived on. It became more than a historical event. It became a living testimony, a symbol of the unfathomable power of the God who had intervened on behalf of his people. And even in the face of future challenges, Hezekiah knew that the God who had spared them once would be with them in the future. The victory was not a one-time event, but a declaration of the sovereignty of God over all the earth. The people of Jerusalem continued to speak of that night as though it had just happened. The stories were passed down from generation to generation, not as a tale of military victory, but as a reminder that God's power was real and present, that his promises were never to be doubted, and that those who placed their trust in him would see his deliverance, no matter the odds. As Hezekiah reflected on those events in his later years, he could not help but marvel at the way God had used a simple, humble king and a small, seemingly insignificant city to show the world that no empire, no matter how mighty, could stand against the will of the Almighty. It was a lesson the world would not soon forget. As Hezekiah grew older, the weight of his experiences continued to shape his reign, and the story of Jerusalem's deliverance took on even greater significance in the hearts of the people. The once quiet king, who had prayed with such fervor for his city's salvation, now spoke with a quiet authority that reflected the lessons he had learned through those dark days. His life had been a testimony not just of military victories, but of the extraordinary power of God's presence. Even in the face of new challenges, Hezekiah's heart remained unwavering, knowing that the same God who had wiped out the Assyrian army with a single stroke could sustain his people through any trial that lay ahead. The people of Jerusalem continued to share the story of their salvation, their words laced with reverence and awe, as though they were speaking of a dream rather than a historical fact. The deliverance they had experienced was not just a miraculous event, it had become woven into the very fabric of their identity as a people chosen and protected by God. It was no longer a single story. They began to speak of it as part of a greater narrative, the ongoing journey of a nation that had experienced firsthand the strength of divine intervention. Hezekiah, though deeply grateful for the miracles that had shaped his reign, began to look at his own legacy with humility. He knew that the true strength of a kingdom lay not in the grandeur of its ruler, but in the enduring faith of its people. He continued to make preparations for the future, ensuring that his successors would carry the torch of faith with the same zeal that had burned in his own heart. He sent out emissaries to distant lands, inviting kings and rulers to learn of the God who had protected them, hoping that their message would be heard. The story of Jerusalem's salvation was spreading far and wide, becoming a beacon of hope for nations who had yet to know the power of the one true God. Hezekiah's reign, though now nearing its end, had not been about political conquest or territorial expansion. It had been a reign of spiritual renewal, a time when the faith of the people had been restored, and their trust in the God of Israel had been solidified for generations to come. And when the day came for Hezekiah to pass from this life, his death was not marked by the kind of grief that often accompanies the end of an era. Instead, the people of Jerusalem mourned as one, not with sorrow, but with a profound sense of gratitude. They knew that they had been part of something far greater than themselves, a moment in history when God had acted decisively to protect them. The stories of Hezekiah's faithfulness, his prayers, his trust in God, and the incredible deliverance of their city lived on long after his reign. They were passed down to their children, to their children's children, like the most precious of heirlooms. And though the city of Jerusalem would face other challenges in the years ahead, one thing remained certain: the legacy of that night, when God's power had been made manifest to all, would never fade. It would forever be a reminder to the people of Israel and the world beyond that no matter the strength of their enemies, there was no power greater than the God who had defended them.